Hello and welcome to RWR Solo. This is the sister podcast and side project of the Random Wrestling Review. I'm Ben Spindler and I host that podcast every single Sunday where myself, Tom and Old Man look at a wrestling show from the past and review it, and we have a bit of an offbeat humour involved there. It's not really just a straight analytical podcast. It's kind of goes in lots of different directions. And that's the reason why this particular show, the RWR Solo show, is unique and exclusive to YouTube, because I didn't want to muddy the waters of what that podcast was and what this podcast is. This is just going to be myself talking straight to yourselves directly. There's going to be a lot less of the humour that's involved in that podcast. This is more of an analytical based show just to give my opinions, my thoughts on the shows that I'm covering. And today I'm covering NXT Takeover Vengeance Day, which took place this past Sunday. It's the second show this week I've watched and really enjoyed. I also covered Impact Wrestling's No Surrender 2021 pay-per-view that took place last Saturday, and that is already up on the YouTube channel. This show, NXT Takeover Vengeance Day, was, I think, a cut above that one. In fact, it was a cut above most shows that I have seen pretty much through my entire wrestling watching life, and that is, now about 30 years of watching wrestling. This was an absolutely phenomenal show, and I'm concerned by how much I thought of the show, given that we're so early in terms of this podcast and this this sort of side project to the podcast that we run, because I've not seen a show like this before in terms of just the absolute consistency of quality of the in-ring product. There were some things that were, I think, down points in terms of what's going on outside of the ring and in terms of the presentation of NXT in regards to that outside of the ring stuff. But in terms of match quality, in-ring action, this is about as good as I've ever seen WWE do in the ring in terms of an overall show. I think on it had an absolutely phenomenal match and then 4 other very good matches. And yes, it's only a show of 5 matches and it's 2.5 hours long. And I think if you had a longer show, as the main roster shows tend to be, the main roster pay-per-views tend to be, you'd struggle to keep up this quality throughout. But in terms of this length of a show with the circumstances that this show was in, I don't see how you could do very much better. And it's a testament to the quality of the matches that every single time a new match began, I was concerned about the ability of that match to follow what had come before. I thought that every single match I went into, I was concerned about burnout. I was concerned about kind of going into the match and being unable to get myself invested and excited for the match in the same way, simply because of how good the previous one was. Couple of notes first of all about the commentary here. So I've not experienced Vic Joseph, Wade Barrett and Beth Phoenix as a commentary team. In fact, of the 3 of them, I've only really heard, I think, Beth Phoenix on a couple of matches in total, and Wade Barrett only on the World of Sport Revival show that ITV did a few years ago. And I thought this was a good commentary team. Vic Joseph seems to me, if you listen to him, the sound of his voice, not necessarily his style, but the sound of his voice, he is very similar sounding to Michael Cole. He just sounds a bit of a younger Michael Cole. But I thought he was very slick. I thought Beth Phoenix was really good and made some really interesting, valid points during the show. And Wade Barrett, I'm not down on him. I'm not negative towards him. I just don't think he is quite as good as the other 2. But I think this is a really good commentary team that really did a good job during this show of calling the action. The show featured 5 matches, all of which had some kind of title attached to them. So there were the 2 Dusty Rhodes Classic Tag Team Finals, both the men's and the women's, plus the NXT Women's and Men's titles, and also the North American title up for grabs. Let's start with the opener then. Dakota Kai and Raquel Gonzalez versus Ember Moon and Shotzi Blackheart in the final of the Women's Dusty Rhodes Classic tournament. This was the first ever women's Dusty Rhodes Classic tournament. And I think that's just, again, there's a feeling overall in WWE where they are basically now positioning both the men and women in an equal context, almost, maybe not necessarily in terms of the men, usually still main event, as they did on this show, for example. But in terms of the numbers of matches and the numbers of awards or trophies or things to fight over are concerned, they've got more of a balance than they ever have before, and you're seeing more often shows that are almost entirely 50-50 in terms of a split between men and women's matches. The women's roster on Raw and SmackDown is still smaller than the men's roster, but in NXT that balance seems to be about as close as it is anywhere else, and that will obviously have a knock-on effect in the future when WWE are looking for future call-ups to either Raw or SmackDown. That will impact the split of matches on those shows too. I was really impressed with this. I thought at first that it was going to be... There were a couple of tentative moments in the beginning, a couple of awkward moments, but after that, and it was very, very short-lived, after that, this became a very dramatic, very exciting match. There were some excellent exchanges involved in this one. I think, in particular, I am really impressed by Shotzi Blackheart. I think she's got a really impressive and intense style about her when she's in the ring, which really kind of makes her believable when she's wrestling. There was a couple of strange things here. So I read this as Dakota Kai and Raquel Gonzalez as being the heels going into this, and I should point out at this point that this is the first I've properly watched an NXT show for about 4 years. As we discussed on our main podcast, we have been out of the loop with wrestling a little bit over the last couple of years, and one of the main reasons I started doing this show is because I've really gotten back into it and gotten eager to watch some of the more modern stuff, and so I'm not always as up on the context of some of the matches that are taking place in terms of who's babyface and who's heel and what storylines are going on. And from what I read and from what I understood from this match was there wasn't a huge amount of context going into most of the matches. You get to see some of the build-up packages that they do before some of these matches, and that gives you some of the context. And from the video packages that were out there, most of it seemed to center around the titles and the fact that either a number one contender was taking on the champion, or we were reaching the final of a specific tournament. And as a consequence, there wasn't a lot of personal issues on the line here. But what I found, going back to what my point was going to be, is Dakota Kai and Raquel Gonzalez, for me, were the heels. But there were large sections of the match here where Dakota Kai seemed to almost be playing the babyface, getting the sympathy on her, whilst Ember Moon and Shotzi Blackheart were effectively double teaming her and keeping her in their side of the corner. It was kind of a strange dynamic that they set the match up with in terms of the premise. Raquel Gonzalez, both for me, looks like the most likely to be a star in the future because she's obviously got that size and that she's got a really believable power move set, but at the same time seems to be the least refined as a performer at this point. And it kind of, that spoke again to the fact that that may be why Dakota Kai was almost placed in this role as being the person who did all the legwork, because it felt to me like Gonzalez is perhaps a little less refined as a performer, as I say, and so they felt like Dakota Kai needed to carry for their side of the aisle most of the match. I was worried towards the end that there was perhaps too many near falls, because this did go through lots of different phases, and the end sequence seemed to last 6-7 minutes. It was quite a long end sequence. But just as they got to a point where I thought they were approaching the point where there just was going to be too many, approaching saturation almost, they had the end of the match, and a powerbomb by Gonzalez allowed her to pin Shotzi Blackheart for them to win the first ever women's Dusty Rhodes Classic. And as I say, I thought this was an excellent match, a really, really great dramatic tag team match, and I was really concerned because they had all kinds of innovative maneuvers, they had all kinds of big impact based falls and bumps, and I just thought, how are they going to follow this? This is a difficult way to start a show because it means that everybody else is going to have to work extra especially hard to follow this match. What they followed it up with was the North American title match between Johnny Gargano and Kushida. And I've got to be honest, I thought this was about as good a match as I've seen on WWE television for many, many years. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. Now, I've seen one or two reviews since talking about the fact that this might have been more of a dream match, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, when, perhaps both were more niche not so mainstream and not so well known to the wider wrestling audience. But for me, this was brilliant, and I just want to talk a minute for because I haven't spoken yet about Kushida's move to the WWE, because I enjoyed Kushida's matches in New Japan, but he was never, for me, one of the most standout performers. I found his act to be a little gimmicky. I mean, I love Back to the Future. It's one of my favourite films, but beyond that kind of the Back to the Future style gimmick that he had with his attire, there just didn't seem much else about Kushida to get excited about, and it felt like when his matches began, they became more about what moves they could do and how exciting those moves could be, rather than building a story and making you care and invest in the match and the result of the match. I also feel like that in New Japan, he had hit a ceiling. He was the junior heavyweight champion multiple times in New Japan, but it didn't feel like management had any plans to make him anything else. It didn't feel like they were going to push him up to the heavyweight division, or that he was high on their list of priorities in terms of making into a major star, in the same way as they'd done with Kenny Omega, for example. And so that being the case, it really felt like Kushida had hit that ceiling in New Japan, and so a move to WWE made a lot of sense. And I kind of compare it to the move Nakamura made a number of years ago. When Shinsuke Nakamura went from New Japan to WWE, he was one of the main guys in New Japan, and probably in the following few years, had he stayed there, would have had feuds with Kenny Omega and with Jay White and with Kota Ibushi returning to the company, Tetsuya Naito as well. Like, they would have had lots of programs for him in big, important main event matches to come. But he left and took a gamble going to WWE. I think Kushida was taking less of a gamble when he went to WWE. I think this allows him to go somewhere else, see if his style works somewhere else, and see if he can develop different skills than he would develop in New Japan. I think one of the things with New Japan is that obviously the in-ring quality is amazing, but there is still a degree of personality that sometimes isn't required in New Japan in the same way as it is in North America to get really over. And I think this will push Kushida to develop some of those skills. And regardless of whether he's successful here or not, in terms of perhaps when he gets to a main roster level, or perhaps he gets into the main events of NXT, regardless of whether he's successful in terms of turning that into a really viable career move, he will probably be strengthened in terms of his position in Japan from having done this, because he'll have, as I say, a whole new set of skills. He'll have experienced an environment different from where his comfort zone was before, and it might give him more of a chance of being that kind of headlining, maybe moving up to the heavyweight division kind of wrestler that I think is obviously more than likely going to be his goal if he was ever to go back there, than he would have ever had a chance of doing if he'd have stayed in Japan. So I think it's a really good move for him. In terms of this match, as I say, for me, it was one of the best matches I've seen on WWE television. They worked a really kind of Japanese style, I thought, to this one. It was, I was a bit concerned when they started the match that it was just going to go straight to sort of high impact aerial maneuvers with lots of high risk factor moves. Basically, they didn't do that. They didn't try to make your jaw drop straight away. They really settled into this with a nice deliberate pace, which picked up after a few minutes and then slowed down again, and then picked up again and then slowed down again. But gradually the overall trend was to get faster and faster and faster and build to a real climax. There were so many innovative maneuvers during this one as well. It meant that you kind of couldn't take your eyes off it. It was a brilliant kind of, one of the innovations, for example, the Spanish fly into an arm lock for a brilliant false finish was just magnificent. They really did do some things I'd never seen before. I thought both were brilliant. I think they both sold really well. There's a great moment when Kushida catched a dive through the ropes. So Johnny Gargano was kind of trying to throw himself through the ropes and tackle Kushida. Kushida caught him and delivered a great headlock suplex, which again, even the suplex itself looked really good. Gargano's facial expressions during that bit as well were just perfect and picked up really well by the commentary team as well. So I thought that was another thing that I really needed to highlight. Yeah, it was fantastic. I was also really quite pleased with the fact that Gargano retained the title. He won in the end with a slingshot DDT for the win. And I was happy with that, because I feel like Kushida needs a bit of time to bed into NXT, get used to the style. He's going to have points in his sort of journey in North America where he has to work styles of matches that perhaps he's not used to. And when I say that, I mean probably more basic, more simple matches than he would be used to working in Japan, where he won't be required to do anything quite as dramatic or impressive as this, where his only requirement will be to go in there and win in 3 or 4 minutes, for example. So he's going to need some time to bed into that style and do things in a bit of a less kind of showy way sometimes. And I think, so having him win this would have been a mistake. I think it's right that they've gone to have him lose, and now he'll have to build himself back up within NXT on a weekly basis. We then had a video package ahead of the men's Dusty Rhodes Cup final. It featured MSK versus grizzled young veterans. Now, I've seen a lot of Zach Gibson and James Drake before. If they've obviously started their careers on the British indie scene, and they've done some amazing things there, and I've really been a big fan of Zach Gibson's work for quite a long time. MSK I've never seen before, and that's not really a surprise because they obviously were new to NXT viewers as well at this point. And I think this is a really interesting thing that I don't think I've seen NXT do before, which is they've effectively used this tournament to introduce an entirely new act in this MSK team and had them go right the way through the tournament to the final as a surprise and then win that final. And I think that's a really good way of introducing an act, a different way, because it's kind of contrary to the way WWE do things, especially with two guys that are kind of their style. You know, they've been fond of perhaps introducing a really big muscle monster kind of wrestler in the past in this way, giving them a major kind of victory right off the bat, but they very rarely introduce a smaller act in quite the same way, and I thought this was really refreshing. Obviously, the thing that sets them apart straight away is clearly their aerials. They have fantastic aerials, this MSK team. In particular, Wesley looked phenomenal in terms of the way he could fly through the air. In particular, a somersault senton that he performed over the kind of turnbuckle without touching the turnbuckle either, onto both Zach Gibson and Jack Drake, looked phenomenal. It was a huge jump. I mean, they've really unearthed a guy that can fly in him. I don't love his name. I think Wesley sounds like a terrible name, and because when you are first introduced to him as an act, you kind of you're wondering whether or not they're just saying that his name's Wesley, as opposed to Wesley. It just doesn't work for me. I think it's a poor name, but that's just, I'm just nitpicking really, because I thought the aerials were fantastic. And again, this made this match a different kind of contest than what we'd just seen. Gargano and Kushida didn't do too much in the way of aerial stuff. They were more about building a great story from the foundation up and getting, more and more impactful and kind of high risk as the match went on. Whereas this one was a great clash of styles. Obviously, Gibson and James Drake are not particularly high flyers, although James Drake did perform a fantastic 450 splash during this one. But the MSK, because they were flying all over the place doing some phenomenal things. I mean, the suicide dive doomsday device on Lee by the grizzled young veterans, I thought was, I've never seen that before either, where basically Zach Gibson had Wesley up on his shoulders outside the ring, and James Drake suicide dive through the ropes, clotheslining Drake properly flipped over as well, landing on his front. Was a real visually impressive match. Again, just a lot of really hard work from these really impressive young talents. Again, not necessarily something that will work everywhere, not necessarily something that will work on every show, but in terms of the context of this show and the match, and giving the Dusty Classic as well the kind of big fight feel that it deserves, I thought this really worked. And they also gave the victory to MSK, which was an interesting one. I thought, I wasn't sure, because I guess you could argue that they've already done a huge amount of build for this MSK team because they've got all the way to the final of the tournament. And I thought there would be no harm in having them lose to Drake and Gibson, but they've decided to go all in with them, and that could potentially mean that their intention is to put MSK right to the top of the card in the tag team division in NXT straight away, which is an interesting approach. So that we were 3 matches in, we were an hour and a half into the show, and I genuinely was like, well, we've had, if I rank each match out of 10, I'm saying we've got an 8, a 9, and an 8 here, which very, very rarely happens. I can't even remember an example of where I would give that sequence of scores to matches. And I'm thinking we've got an hour left. There's just 2 matches. I'm not sure how I can maintain my level of interest for the rest of those matches. I was exhausted after having watched these 3 matches and thought, going forward, this is going to be a little bit of a chore. And if there is one match on this show that suffers from that burnout because of the quality and the drama that's taken place in those first 3 matches, it is this next one, which is for the NXT Women's title match. Io Shirai, Toni Storm, Mercedes Martinez. I wasn't sure why this was a triple threat match. It felt as if they didn't need to have Martinez in the match. They could have just had this as Io Shirai against Toni Storm. And especially as Io Shirai didn't lose the belt. Like I always think, and maybe this is exactly why they didn't do it, but I always think that a triple threat match, if you're going to have one for a title, it gives you a really good way of having somebody else win a title without pinning the champion. And then allowing you to have them go like a head-to-head in a rematch, one-on-one, to allow the person who's now the champion to prove themselves properly against the former champion. Now, I know that actually what tends to happen is WWE double bluff themselves into going, actually, because that's possible, we're not going to do that in this triple threat match. And they do this a lot, to be honest. But it just felt like it just felt like a bit pointless that this was a 3-way. It could have just been easily just as good with a one-on-one. And as I say, if there was one match that suffered from a bit of audience fatigue during the show, it was this one. I think it would have been better on a show which wasn't full of other very, very good matches. I've not got a huge amount to say about it. As I say, there's only so many things that when you kind of look back on a wrestling show that you can take out of it. There's only so many things that you can remember, and that's part of the trick of great wrestling booking is that that with each show you want to accomplish 2 or 3 things that you want people to stay in people's minds, to kind of push them into, or to incentivize them to watch the next episode of NXT or to watch the next big show, whatever it may be. And as a consequence of everything else that was going on this show, this one just feels like there wasn't a lot to remember about it, which is all the more reason, I guess, that Io Shirai retained the title, because if she'd have lost the belt here, it would have felt a bit like, actually, well, what have we achieved with her losing the title here? Because it's going to get lost in the kind of amount of weight of things that there are to think about and to be impressed by, and to kind of that will leave a lasting impression on you. So Shirai won with the moonsault on Martinez, and that's about all I've got to say on it. Not a bad match at all, actually, still well above average. It's just on this show where everything was well above average, something had to suffer, not only in my kind of memory, but also just in terms of overall match quality. You can't maintain such a high level for so long. And I think, for example, if you extended this show out by another half an hour to make it kind of standardized WWE pay-per-view length, then you'd have to slot in to here and there a couple of matches that were much shorter, much less important, and were designed to entirely bring the crowd down. And it didn't feel like there was anything designed to bring the crowd down, which meant that the stuff that wasn't designed to do that suffered as a consequence. Before the main event, we were shown a video package of LA Knight signing with NXT. LA Knight is the former Eli Drake, used to be in Impact Wrestling, and I've got to be honest, I never liked Eli Drake's work in Impact Wrestling. He came across to me as a very old-fashioned type wrestler. The person I was equating him with when I watched him was Lex Luger. Like his offense and his look and his general demeanor came across to me as quite 1980s looking, and it never really was something I ever really enjoyed about him. Here, I thought he did actually look kind of charismatic and looked like he would get over quite well as a kind of smarmy, cocky heel. And I hope that he is a lot more interesting as a member of the NXT roster than I ever found him previously when he worked for Impact Wrestling. I guess time will tell, and we'll see. But as I say, for me, I wasn't excited to see him turning up. But I think this was a good indication. Actually, he might be more entertaining in this context than where I've seen him previously. So then finally we had the main event, Finn Balor against Pete Dunne, NXT title match. There was this was, again, a match where I felt like I was going to struggle to live up to the expectation following everything that had taken place previously. And I've got to be perfectly honest, in the past, I've not been as up on Finn Balor as a lot of people are. Like, when he first turned up in NXT, when he first got promoted to the main roster in WWE, and some of his subsequent work after that point, I just found him not that interesting. Like, he's got a great entrance and the great visual of that entrance, and I think the crowd really get into that. But beyond that, there's nothing to him. I don't really know what I'm supposed to feel about Finn Balor. I'm not really sure who he's supposed to be or what he's supposed to feel or what his motivating factors are. There just doesn't seem to have been much work that's gone into that part of his act. And so at a very basic level, yes, he looks great when he comes out and he does get a reaction from the crowd upon his entrance. But when the matches get going, I always find them just a little bit of a disappointment. And I don't think they've changed anything about that here. Like, this was still the Finn Balor that I've seen in the past. Like, again, once he was in the ring, I just struggle to feel anything for him, like whether I care about him, whether I dislike him, whether I like him, whatever it is. I just don't ever get that sense that I can invest myself in whatever he's trying to put across. Luckily here, Pete Dunne was his opponent, and I've been a major fan of Pete Dunne, again, for a very long time. Again, another wrestler that's made his name on the British independent scene and is now really coming through the ranks to headline an NXT Takeover show. He's getting, closer and closer to the top of the industry as he goes. I'd also say that Dunne looks like he's in the best shape I've ever seen him in. He's really slimmed down now. He's got a very athletic physique, which he's always looked quite good, but I think he looks even more athletic than perhaps previously. To avoid the issues with trying to follow what had come previously, they did a really good job here of changing the style of match that they were going to have. So they took this right back to basics, had a really good early period, 5 minutes or so, of mat-based stuff, concentrating on certain body parts. So Balor was concentrating on Dunne's ankle, and Dunne was concentrating on Balor's fingers mainly. And what they did is they kind of almost gave themselves a come-down period. So they, instead of having the match where everybody kind of, you bring the crowd down, they tried to bring the crowd down, to bring the audience down with part of their own match by giving you this 5 minute period of quite logic based and really interesting, almost escapology type wrestling. It wasn't quite, the standard you might have seen in the old world of sport, but it was, it was quite logical in terms of the holds and counter holds that the two were exchanging. It was quite a European style matchup, which, whilst not really flashy and probably had a few people kind of like, oh, I'm not sure about this is going to be a bit slow and whatnot, it worked really well because it meant that you knew you didn't have to be super into it. You could sit back and relax and breathe as an audience, as part of the audience, and just kind of like let it wash over you a little bit. Which then meant that when they did start to up the pace and make it more dramatic and bring in the bigger moves and the more of the innovations, you were able to respond to them. You'd had a period of recovery as a part of the audience to go, actually, I'm really into this now. And they built it then from there to a really brilliant crescendo. This, I got to be honest, I think this is about the best Finn Balor match I've ever seen. As I said previously, I've never been as big on Finn Balor as I was here. This was just an excellent match, though. In the end, was I a little bit disappointed with the result? Possibly. Again, I'm quite invested in Dunne, and I quite like the idea of him going as far as he possibly can. But I still thought it was a great match. It ended after Balor forcibly removed Pete Dunne's gum shield from his mouth, then kicked him with a sort of double kick into the face immediately afterwards, then performed the coup de grace, and then the 1916 DDT to finish the match and win overall. But it was a great little contest, and I was really impressed overall with this match and everything in terms of the match quality and in-ring action during the show. What I want to get to now, though, is the negative of this show for me, which was the sense that there's not an awful lot of story taking place. There's not a lot of plot that's going on. It didn't feel like, in all the build-up, as I said earlier on, in all the build-up videos, there didn't seem to be much of a personal nature. There was a little bit for the main event and a little bit for the women's title match, but there wasn't a lot, and it mainly seemed to be centered around the fact that Balor had the title and Dunne wanted it. The same went for Io Shirai, had the title, and the two contenders for that belt wanted it. There wasn't anything over and above that. And of course, the two Dusty Classic matches were based around the fact that these two teams had gotten to the final, not because they had any kind of personal issue with one another. And that kind of sort of spread out into the rest of the show. For example, earlier on in the show, before Johnny Gargano came out to face Kushida, Austin Theory, who's one of Johnny Gargano's sort of stablemates, disappeared, and I think the idea is that Dexter Lumis has in some way kidnapped him or attacked him or something, and he sends Candice LeRae and Indy Hartwell back to go find him, and then you hear nothing else of that during the rest of the show, despite the fact that then Johnny Gargano performs in this great match with Kushida, and it lasts for quite some time. You never see the rest of them at any other point. The same goes for kind of the in the main event. Pete Dunne obviously has got Martin Stone and Oney Lorcan with him, but they don't stay with him at ringside. They leave the ringside area, which again you feel is a bit of a strange situation, because if they are trying to if they're banded together as a group, then it just feels natural that, especially as they attack Finn Balor after the match, that they would get involved in the match itself. And so I just felt like there was just a lack of story to get me invested in continuing to watch NXT week by week. And I wonder whether or not this is why NXT struggled a little bit in terms of the ratings that have been recently published, going head to head with AEW, because it isn't providing for me enough of that kind of that plot story based part of the show, which I think is a massive part of what makes wrestling unique and exciting. And I wonder whether or not this leads in well to that kind of end angle that took place, or whether or not this is an attempt by NXT to up their game in that area, because obviously what happens after the match is that Finn Balor gets attacked by Oney Lorcan and Danny Burch, and Pete Dunne joins in. Three of them are attacking him. And then the Undisputed Era came out to save Balor, and they seem to be striking up at least a friendship. They shake his hand, they look like they're going to pose together, only for Adam Cole to then superkick Balor, and for Kyle O'Reilly to take exception to that. He doesn't like the fact that Adam Cole's done it, and then Adam Cole superkicks O'Reilly as well, and so effectively the Undisputed Era is no more, and we are, I suppose, apparently going to see now a feud where Adam Cole is up against Kyle O'Reilly. We may also see what happens in terms of Roderick Strong and potentially in the future Bobby Fish's response to that is, are they going to stay with Adam Cole? Are they going to kind of also go their own way? What's going to happen there? And so it felt like an attempt, I guess, by NXT to start to strike up a bit more of a plot-based approach to its main event scene, because, as I say, going into this match, it didn't feel like we had this great kind of personal, bitter storyline rivalry between the two, other than because Pete Dunne wanted Finn Balor's World Championship. And I think that's something that NXT probably needs to work on. In the ring, fantastic, absolutely almost flawless in terms of this show. One of the, as I said at the start of the show, one of the best shows potentially I've ever seen in 30 years of watching pro wrestling. The consistent quality was untrue, and I think in particular the Kushida versus Johnny Gargano match was out of this world. But there is a sense that that's coming at the price or the cost of presenting really exciting and interesting storylines that you can invest in as a viewer and kind of get emotionally interested in. So that's my review of NXT Vengeance Day, and NXT Takeover Vengeance Day, I should say. As I said, a really, really good show. I would recommend anybody watches it. It is phenomenal. That's just about all I've got time for today, and I've covered everything anyway in the show. So I will sign off now, but thanks for getting this far if you have done. Obviously, give the channel a subscribe. That would be really helpful. We're looking to grow the YouTube channel as much as we can. And also, if you can, check out our weekly podcast. The Random Wrestling Review takes place every Sunday, and as I said, it's got a bit of a more an offbeat. We do a lot of the analytical stuff. We talk a lot about the quality of the matches and the storylines and the characters, just as I've done here. But within all that, we also have a little bit of an irreverent kind of flavour to it with some humour and some slightly offbeat things that you might be interested in. But yeah, thank you for joining me today, and I will see you next time.